I did pass the bar. I am currently listed as an inactive attorney with the Ohio Bar. So I can't really be practicing law in the traditional sense, but sadly, I do think like those lawyer type people pretty regularly, as I say with a lot of love to all my legal friends in the legal community. So a little bit of background, as Bishop Dillahunt alluded to, we started this conversation, I think it was the fall of 2012. Or sometime around then, before I was consecrated. And we started having a conversation around the synod about what would advocacy look like in Ohio. Well, very quickly, we said we need to be talking to the two other synods in the ELCA and as well as the Washington, D.C. Advocacy Office. Because in a lot of states, they have these state public policy offices. So what we did from there is I reached out to the DC office, knew some folks there, and they said, look to work ecumenically if you want to make this have a strong foundation to build up a program. So as we began to look ecumenically, I connected with Episcopalians, Methodists, the UCC, and others, and I realized a lot of the people I were connecting to were already involved with the Hunger Network in Ohio. And their director at the time, Bob Erickson, was getting ready to retire, and they were looking for what are the next steps for the Hunger Network? What does faith-based advocacy look like in Ohio? So they had been kind of declining in revenues and supports, just like many ministries have over the past, few decades, and we're struggling. So we said, wait a second, we got some Lutheran money. We have this Hunger Network program where a lot of people already have some buy-in. Why reinvent the wheel? Let's combine them together. So in 2016, Bob Erickson retired and I became the director of the Hunger Network, and we officially became a state public policy office for the ELCA, working with the other state offices and our advocacy office in DC. So in addition to my work with the Hunger Network, I also serve as the budget and tax policy director for a coalition called One Ohio Now. That is a very broad-based secular coalition looking at a lot of the same issues on how do we make sure we are investing adequately into our communities. Prior to that, I also did homeless youth advocacy, working directly with independent youth, especially those youth kind of in that 15 to 24-year-old age range. And we'll see programs now in Columbus like the Star House that I had involvement in before it was even the Star House. We just called it a drop-in center, and new foster care rules and things like that, to specifically try to help these youth during these ages of transition. And so it's always exciting for me to see these programs that we were talking about and felt like we weren't making any progress on in those early years, because the progress was being made. So I like to say that to remind us that with advocacy, we are often laying a foundation for future change in our world to improve opportunities. So right now I live in Columbus, the Hilltop neighborhood. We have two kids, 6 and 11. They are at home right now and I am not, because it's a Saturday morning and I can't force them to go and do more work on their computers on on weekends, because they get enough of that when they're doing virtual learning at home with me. But I'm a Clevelander at heart, so sorry, Reds fans. I will always be a backer of my Cleveland baseball team and my Browns over y'all's Bengals and Reds. Sorry, but it's true. Clevelanders know what it is all about. So hopefully everybody watched the video that we sent out in advance. If you did not, here's the short recap. After I do the recap, feel free to, if anyone has any questions, feel free to chime in at that time. So in the 25 minute or so intro video, we talked about how advocacy is communicating to people with authority to do something. I love the example of, my kids in the months leading up to Christmas. They're advocating to me and my wife to buy them certain presents. We also can think of, lawyers advocate for clients, but the kind of advocacy we're talking about is faith-based advocacy to policymakers to create change in the community. Advocacy, the other big point of that video is we went through some of the biblical roots of advocacy. Moses was an advocate and Lutheran. In the Confessions, Martin Luther was a strong advocate for anti-poverty programs, universal education, and a lot of these other great programs that were developed during that time. Advocacy is about addressing the problem at the root. Asking that hard question, on hunger, for example, why are people hungry. Advocacy is addressing the problems for the community, not just individuals. You know, we can see the person who's hungry in front of us, and as people of faith, we are called to feed those people who are hungry today. But we are also called to recognize that there are many other people hungry. In Ohio right now during the pandemic, about 1 in 5 Ohioans have experienced hunger. We can't, you know, our youth groups can't make enough peanut butter and jelly sandwiches to address that much need. And advocacy, like all ministry, is about being in relationship. It's about a relationship. So advocacy is our relationship with our neighbor. I might not have the ability to meet the person who grows my food or the person who lives downstream from them. And I would hate the fact that if my farmer had to destroy the water supply for that neighbor downstream so that they could make a profit or to survive, to make sure that I have food to eat today. So how are we in relationship with all these people we never meet? And this is why public policy comes in, because public policy and our laws are, simply put, how we as a community have decided to be in relationship with one another. You look at environmental laws, they are not just to say, ha, 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 we have new regulations, but how do we make sure that the water is staying clean for everybody? How do we make sure the air is staying clean for everybody and usable? You know, economic laws, you know, around, you know, taxes and minimum wages and these things. Ask that question, you know, do they always get it right? No, we're sinful human beings. Of course, we don't always get it right. More often than not, we mess something up or we create more problems, and we have to address those too. But advocacy is about being in relationship with one another and trying to live into that right relationship that God has called us to be in. So that's the 20-minute video, or so, 20 so minutes of that video that we sent out in advance. Did anyone have any questions or comments about anything presented in the video? All right. So at the Hunger Network in Ohio, we break our policy into 4 main categories: about feeding people today, educating to end hunger, building an economy that works for all, and building healthy homes and communities. So I just want to lift up a few of the things that we have done advocacy around related to these issues. For example, on feeding people today, we have advocated around SNAP, the formerly known as food stamps, to make sure that we have SNAP dollars as our #1 defense against hunger in our communities. But with that, it's more than just advocating at the federal level for these programs, but also at the state level to make sure we protect and have effective administration of these programs. So that gets into a lot of nuance and detail and boring ODJFS regulations that I'm not going to bore y'all with today. That we also do a lot of advocacy around, because those small little nuanced policy things are very important. You know, during the pandemic, we have worked in coalition to advocate for expanded SNAP benefits around the pandemic. Around education, school funding, school funding, school funding. That's one of our top issues right now, making sure kids have access to good quality preschools in all communities, rural, urban, suburban, it doesn't matter. Every child deserves an education. We've done work around unemployment compensation and discrimination on race, gender, sex, orientation, ethnicity, and making sure that our economy is structured to be a benefit to everybody. We also do advocacy around housing issues, clean water. I had a great conversation on Thursday with Representative Sheehy from Northwest Ohio around clean water and how to make sure that we are protecting our natural resources in Lake Erie and our rivers and streams from pollution. And he's been working real closely with the agricultural community as well as environmentalists to try to figure out this question. So I learned a lot from him just the other day around what does it take to actually have healthy homes and communities. So those are kind of just a quick overview of some of the policy issues that we've done work on in just the past 4 or 5 years as the Hunger Network with people of faith. Does anyone have any specific questions around any of those policy issues or other issues that we may or may not have worked on? And Pastor Katie, I do not have my chat box open because it's easier for me to read the screen with it closed. So if anyone puts anything in the chat, just let me know. All right. So I try to do most of my talking toward the beginning of my presentations, and we'll get into a lot more pair share here very soon, and group conversation. So one of the big things when we look at advocacy around hunger and poverty, or really any issue, is they cannot be solved by charity alone. So I think it's always important to remember that we are always building on something else when we do our advocacy within our congregations or in our communities. So for example, in hunger in Ohio, or in food insecurity, it's been not going in the right direction. Now you might see it peak and see it coming down and say, hey, that looks good for that little blue line right there. But look at where the blue line ends in 2019. It's higher than where it was 20 years earlier. And 2019 was allegedly a strong economy. So this is very concerning to me that our new good points are worse off than where they were previously. Because we can assume that the economy will always be having ups and downs, and factory closes or a pandemic or a worldwide recession, are going to cause more people to experience hunger. But then the problem is, how are we responding? And in Ohio, looking at state-based advocacy, we used to do better than the nation, and now we're doing worse than the national average. Unsurprisingly, the poverty rate in Ohio followed a similar path. Once again, we see throughout the 2000s, when once again, the economy was allegedly roaring in the mid 2000s and real strong, but we see poverty in Ohio and across the nation ticking upward. And one of the reasons is because of inequality. The economy was doing very, very well for those at the top and very, very poorly for those who are just scraping by. And once again, unsurprisingly, poverty follows the same path, where our good point in 2019 was higher than where we were in the early 2000s. Well, in Ohio, they did actually notice some of this trend going on in the early 2000s. And what did they decide to do? They decided that their main strategy to address the growing poverty and other decline in different social issues was going to be tax cuts. So in June of 2005, Ohio passed a massive tax cut package, slashing state income tax rates, eliminating corporate profit tax, and many, many other things. There were some good things in those tax changes as well, but it was a massive tax shift that had, over the past 15 years, the state has doubled down on this strategy, cutting state income tax rates 9 times. And with the goal of creating jobs. Well, as you can see by the data here, that strategy just has not worked in Ohio. So we do these massive tax changes and our job growth rate has trailed the nation continuously. So I share all that and these next statistics to remind us about how these problems that we are looking at cannot just be solved by the church alone. We have an important role to play, but we cannot solve these things by ourselves. They are systemic. They're our community-wide issues that we're dealing with. So in Ohio, it's always important to remember that these aren't, just Southern issues. I grew up and it was always, well, Alabama is racist, Ohio is not. And I think we all know that's just, yes, Alabama has their issues, but a lot of these racial inequalities, and it's not about, one person saying, I don't like people of color, but more about our systems being built in a way that ignore Black, Indigenous, and people of color around us. So in Ohio, infant mortality, children below the age of 1, 3 times the rate for African Americans compared to white Ohioans. Wages, there's a 35% wage gap between white and Black Ohioans in the workforce. And some people say, well, has it gotten better? And the answer is no, it's actually gotten worse. In 1979, this number was only about 11%. So it's tripled over the past 30 to 40 years for that wage gap. And as we are all too familiar with involvement in the criminal justice system, African Americans are more likely to be imprisoned. This comes from judges have predispositions to be more harsh against African Americans. Prosecutors are less likely to deal with African Americans as they are with white folks. right down the line, there's just all these biases built in over policing and other things that friends of mine who within the faith community are doing criminal justice reform could do 3 hours on where all these different the racial biases exist in our system. And once again, it's not just about an individual thinking a racist thought or a prejudicial thought. These are things where good people might be in a system, and then they just continue to allow a system that has problems to continue on the way it always has. All right. So that's a lot of data. Hopefully I have not bored you off data. I love my numbers. A lot of people love a good story, but if Jesus came to me and said, all right, I'm going to tell you a parable, I'm like, no, Jesus, I just want the data. Give me the data. So are there any questions? I go through the data real fast. I know I love data, but I know most people don't. Are there any questions about data? And we can go back and look at any of those charts that you want. Well, alrighty then. So the reality is we need a savior. So often we look at, who can be the savior for these things? And, we as the church are not necessarily it. Because we all know, we can also think about who else do we put up as saviors in our community? We often put up, politicians or elected officials or talking media personalities. As, well, if we just let this person be, I remember back in the mid 2000s, everyone was saying Jon Stewart should run for president. And Jon Stewart was always like, I would make a horrible president. I don't know what y'all are talking about, because Jon Stewart knew he was not a savior, but everyone enjoyed him. I enjoyed him. I thought he provided good political and comedy around a lot of these issues, but he knew he wasn't going to be the savior, even though he is a very strong advocate right now around and has been for many years for first responders after 9/11, making sure that they have the medical treatment and insurance coverage that they need. But it's not by him being the savior and saving all these folks. Jon Stewart, I think, recognizes the need to be a servant first. So how is it, so this is a question for the group. Feel free to unmute yourselves. How does the story of Jesus washing the feet, what are some of the values that are communicated by Jesus to us that we can translate over to advocacy? And of course, as a deacon, I'm going to bring up the washing of the feet story. So what do folks think? No ideas?
You're just asking an awful lot to talk on a Saturday morning.
Yeah. Yes, it is. I'm doing I have coffee and diet soda right now, so I'm very well caffeinated.
That's good. Well, we always preach it as a story of humility and of doing the task that needs to be done rather than putting oneself forward as the end all and be all.
Yeah, no, I think you nailed it on the head. Thank you so much for that. The idea of humility, in advocacy, especially as people of faith, when I go down the State House, people know that myself and the pastors and clergy and lay folks that I'm surrounded by are not there for our own benefit. We are there to benefit the community. We are there talking about issues that we think are going to help society as a whole. And people, and so there's that genuineness that comes through. And also the idea of humility. When can we put forward, not our own voices, but can we lift up the voices of those who have been marginalized, putting their stories and their voices first and them themselves in front of ourselves. One of the things about the foot washing that I always find so powerful is this power. Jesus, the Son of God, about to be crucified on a cross and risen again 3 days later. Somebody's unmuted, and there's some background noise. Okay. But Jesus says that, that Jesus adopts that position of servant first. I think is really powerful.
I think Pastor Bankson had something to say. I'm going to let him unmute himself again. Thank you.
There we go. I think I'm in.
Yes.
One of the things I think about in relation to the serving is that because of the resurrection, we are in Christ free from death, free from fear, and we are free to serve. I think this is something that sometimes is missed, that the resurrection, which we celebrate, shows that the way of the cross was indeed the way of life in the world, in the image of Christ. But without the resurrection, there's not enough power in us to do that. So the resurrection frees us. It says we have nothing to fear. God is said yes, and the power of Jesus and the Spirit are alive to guide and direct and empower us.
Yeah, and it's one of these things with that idea of freedom where so often we get nervous around the idea of engaging, lawmakers. Or when I talk about lawmakers, I'm not just talking about, state house, folks or congressional reps or presidents. I'm talking about township trustees and school board members, trying to figure out, do we put a levy on the ballot or not? And having that conversation. I know I've heard Bishop Eaton share stories about when she was in a call up in Northeastern Ohio. Bishop Eaton was, at school board meetings talking, about school levy issues, and they're difficult and they're hard and they're messy, and you have people who have been hurt by different systems and institutions. But we are called to hear those stories and to engage in trying to figure out, what does a solution look like, and how do we help those who might not agree with the solution that is arrived at by the community? How do we help those that disagree continue to be welcomed into that story and into that community? And these are hard questions, but yet we have the freedom through Christ, I think, to engage in them. And if not us, so many other people are tied to specific loyalties and interests that they don't have that freedom, to really try to wrestle and engage with these conversations. One thing as we look at this and the humble servant, can we win? Can we actually say, I say, don't, we see people are hungry and how do we feed them today? But can we end hunger? A lot of people in the world would say, no, that's a ridiculous thing. But once again, that idea of freedom, we have the freedom and the wildness of the Christian faith to say, yeah, you know what? Jesus told us to pray, give us this day our daily bread. Let's figure out how to make sure that every single person has their daily bread. But as the community is having these conversations, I'd love to do a little brainstorm right now. What is it that the faith community brings to the table? What is it that we offer to these conversations?
The example of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
The moral imperative of loving your neighbor.
I think a belief in the abundance of God, that there is enough and more for all people. And it can be easily shared, the challenges to find the best way of distribution
Mhm.
so that all have what they need, not what they want necessarily.
The recognition of the importance of relationship.
Mm.
And a recognition that all are created in God's image and that all are children of God. So that tends to kind of push hierarchies down and tame them, which is a little countercultural, but even in the United States.
Very countercultural.
Yes,
Very
even in the United States.
And hold on to some of that issue of hierarchy. We're going to be coming to it. I hope everyone knows the story of Star Wars very well coming up. I said I'd do my talk at the beginning.
Yeah. But also because we're in relationship and we've been doing these serving ministries, people serving in churches often have observed experiences of poverty, the experiences of those who have been pushed to the margins, that other people, perhaps state, lawmakers or even just business people in a town just don't have. They just don't have that experience, and it isn't necessarily willful blindness, although sometimes it probably is, but there's a kind of blindness, blinkers that keep them from seeing what's real, what the job is that needs to be done, as Chris said when she's talked about Jesus washing feet. He did the job that needed to be done, which meant he observed what needed to be done and then did it.
I think related to that is our belief that God gives us, each of us and all of us together, gifts to use, and that there are various ways in which those gifts can be brought to the issue at hand. I think of the example that most of us have heard, give a person a fish and you feed them for a day, teach a person to fish and you enable them to, have the knowledge. But there's another third step that's not often mentioned, and that is if people don't have access to where the fish are, all the knowledge that they have about fishing or attaining something is for naught. So advocacy is speaking up to make sure everybody has access to the resources and the opportunities in life that we would all like to have. So I think our faith helps us to see those different areas and the flexibility and the fact that some of us have gifts in one area of maybe giving, the charity, some in teaching or enabling, and others in the advocacy.
Yeah, and that access is one of the reasons why at the Hunger Network we have engaged on things like when there are the ballot issues that went forward around redistricting to improve our redistricting process and around voting rights and things like that, why we have advocated for them to make sure that those who are most impacted by these decisions have the access to the ballot box, have access to fair districts and competitive districts to be voting for their representatives and senators in. So yeah, just, and that's some of the language that we have used when we've testified and worked with legislators on encouraging them to pass those more equitable things. And we will be, once again, when there's potentially a bad bill coming down the pike around voting rights in Ohio, that could potentially mirror what we saw in Georgia.
Yeah, we often talk about advocacy is about giving the voiceless a voice, like we step in and are their voice, but really more powerfully and healthier would be to lift up their own voices, because we only interpret as through what do they say, as through a mirror darkly, or our interpretation is faulty at best. But letting people speak for themselves, giving them the opportunity to speak for themselves, will lead us to a healthier system, a healthier world.
We are not the saviors. Jesus
We
is.
are not the saviors, right?
We are called to be part of the body of Christ in relationship with others. Yep.
Yes.
So these are all rich, great ideas, and very happy because I think I can sum all of these things as I've been writing them down can be summarized in these 3 words. So we tell stories. We can tell the story of a radical God whose love and abundance is there for all of us. That we had, Jesus taught through stories. We can teach through stories. We're in relationship with so many folks. I think of the food pantry as a great example. We're in relationship. Members of our congregations are in line at those food pantries. They are receiving those SNAP benefits. And as a church, as the body of Christ, we are in relationship with those members. Obviously, we're in relationship with the volunteers and the people that bring in the canned food and throw the loose change in the kettle on Sunday mornings for a noisy collection and things. We're in relationship with them, and we can hear their stories on why they contribute, why they get involved. And then we're in relationship with those, kind of bigger donors. We're in relationship, the CEO of a local company sits in a congregation, potentially on Sunday, or somebody knows who that CEO is, who is sitting in one of our congregations, and can make those asks, bring them in. I remember once we were working with homeless youth and over at the YWCA Family Shelter in Columbus, and some youth who had previously lived there were part of our program, and they would go back, 4 or 5 times a year and serve dinner. And then they would also then go and talk to all the teenagers about some of the stuff we were doing and begin organizing. And it was a great fun. Well, we had a tech company up in the Westerville area that was sponsoring us and came down to help us, and they said, sure, we'll come down and help serve a meal. So their CEO pulls up to the shelter in a Jaguar. And we put him on dish because you're just a servant in here. You got to go do dishes. And we had a young man, his name was Josh. He was 14, but he looked like he was about 10. He was just real tiny and stuff, and he was over there. And this CEO was burnt out in about 10 minutes doing dish at the shelter. They have the big industrial machine, got to load the rack, push it through, pull it up, unload, dry, and the CEO was exhausted. But Josh just kept on moving, kept on plugging away for the 2 hours we were there getting all the dishes done. And this CEO looked at him and said, if wealth were based on work, you would be the guy driving the Jaguar and not me. Because the CEO couldn't cut it. He could not keep up with this 14-year-old kid in a kitchen. And there's just so much power in that relationship, which brings us to the 3rd word of power. We have power in the world as the church. We have the power of Christ. And we're going to go into power in a little bit more here in just a second. So these are the things that I think we bring to the table as, the church, kind of the big, body of Christ concept of what is the church. But what are some of the things, I'm going to probably just put these in what I call the parking lot, things to come back to later, possibly, hopefully. So these are the things I think we have to be able to win, kind of in the theoretical sense. I'm curious, what do you think your congregation would need to be able to win, however you see winning in your congregational setting being?
I'll indulge my comment one more time. I think our particular congregation probably has plenty of power in it. You define it by resources and the location where we're at and so forth. But sometimes we don't get the stories, and sometimes we are limited in our relationships to people outside of our particular, social economic bracket. And so the maybe part of the struggle or the challenge is to especially develop the relationship to help people go outside their own skin, if you will, as a church. Other churches may have very different, challenges, but that's I think the one for my particular congregation.
No, that's a great insight, Glenn. Thank you. And I know your congregation. I think you're spot on.
Mm-hmm.
Carla, did I see you unmute yourself a second ago?
Well, I think we mostly need direction. I think we have a lot of people who would like to get involved and are just not quite sure how to get started.
Great. And I hope we answer that question in the slides, Carla. I put that at the end to do kind of some of the theory first and then kind of piece it together at the end. Anybody else? So in my years of doing this work, I think a lot of our congregations do have the power, but then they lack the relationship or the stories. And often our congregations that have the stories don't necessarily have the power. I mean, I think a great example is, I got a few congregations in Columbus that have amazing stories and amazing congregational leaders. But that's one of those things they say, well, I called my congressperson or my state representative. And I'm like, yeah, but that person doesn't have much power right now. In this, that, or, in these different ways. And they're like, oh, and it's like, no, it's still good to call. It's still good to have those relationships. But then when they call their state representatives, it's like, gosh, I wish their story could go up to Glenn's congregation and be having those conversations with, Jordan and, which we do, we do try to set those up as best we can. And then direction. Yeah, we see the need. We see hunger growing in our communities. We see the problems that exist. We see people, asking for assistance and some of you have probably heard me, give the example of my son when he came home one day from first grade and, realized a friend of his was going hungry, and him dealing with his emotions of being angry because the kid stole his snack and being sad about it. And when I looked it up on Google, was the word for being angry and sad at the same time. It gave me the word cynical, and things like that. And it was like, oh, that is the way the world responds though. When we don't have we see the suffering, we want to do something, we don't have that direction, and how to really make an impact. We become dejected, and it's like it's easier just to throw up our hands in frustration. So I think those are two great things that our congregations need to win. So hopefully we'll be able to fix all that by noon today. Oh, story time. So there is this policy. We had a young woman named Brooklyn with our program. Brooklyn lived here in Columbus with her mother. Her mom was a school teacher and her mom died of cancer. Brooklyn didn't have much of a relationship with her father, and her dad who wasn't in the picture, so she went and she was living with her pastor and his wife and their family while she finished high school. Now, Brooklyn was real smart, great cello player, graduated high school with great grades. Sorry about that. Graduated with great grades, played the cello, was offered scholarship money to go to Capital University. So this was 2007, 2008. I had graduated as an undergrad in 2006. She had filled out her financial aid information and was denied everything. Her merit-based scholarships, her need-based scholarships, all of it. She was denied because she didn't have a parent's information to put on her financial aid forms. Because her dad, she had no relationship with him. So even though she qualified for need-based aid, even though she qualified for merit-based scholarships, the policy was to deny her everything. Now, as I said, I had just graduated from the school. a few years earlier. So I still knew the financial aid office people very, very well. So I went in and talked to them with Brooklyn and tried to be an individual advocate for her. It took over a month to get an exemption and an appeals process to go through to get her access to her financial aid award letter. Well, that's not good. And if you apply to multiple schools, how do you compare when you have to go through these appeals process at each institution? So she wasn't able to do it. Or, eventually we helped her get in, but it took a lot of work. So we took Brooklyn's story and realized it wasn't just her, it was a lot of folks. And we went and we wanted to figure out, could we pass a law or do it, administrative rule change at the federal level to make it easier for kids like Brooklyn who are independently homeless to access things. So as we went through this process, we were first in relationship with youth who are in need and with the financial aid officers. So we heard their story and their perspective to understand where the problem was. We were in relationship with both sides of this conflict. We realized that we could not do charity or just help individuals out on a case-by-case basis. It was too large of a problem and it was too big of a systematic issue to fix one at a time. So those are two of the things that we needed for the win. We knew what we wanted. We wanted to make an easier process, a streamlined process to help youth who are independently homeless to access higher education. And then we had to develop a strategy. We had to figure out what are the opportunities and the barriers. Who are our allies and enemies? And the reality is nobody was our enemy on this. It just was low priority. This was the mid-2000s. We had wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Katrina, hurricane had just hit, and there was a lot of some of the corruption around those issues, and incompetence around the federal response to Katrina and some other things. And there was a worldwide recession on the horizon that people in Congress were starting to get gear up for because they knew it was coming and it was going to be bad. So you had all these different things. So why would you care about a one-page bill around homeless youth? So then we developed our strategy. What is it that we need to do to fix this? We reached out to people in other states and national groups who were able to help write the legislative language. We then loaded up a few vans, drove to Washington, D.C. with youth, had a bunch of legislative meetings. And with this, we got, some of you might remember, former Congressman Dennis Kucinich, who is left of center, to put it clearly, quite far left of center, I would say, on many things. He signed on as a co-sponsor. We also got a guy that some of you might know named Jim Jordan to sign on as a co-sponsor, who is not left of center. He is not center. He is pretty far right of center. Both of them signed on as co-sponsors to this bill. Why? Because they saw the stories. Now, my role as an advocate in that situation was not to go and convince Jim Jordan and Dennis Kucinich to sign on. My job was to schedule meetings and to drive the van. The youth were the ones who shared their stories. We were then able to get Congresswoman Stephanie Tubbs Jones out of the east side of Cleveland. At the time before her passing, she was really impressed with one of our youth. Her name was Tiara's story and the conversation she had with Tiara. And Tiara was a constituent, had this issue as well. So Stephanie Tubbs Jones, Congresswoman Tubbs Jones, issued a challenge to a friend of hers in California and said, Ohio's going to have more co-sponsors to this bill than California will. Well, obviously, we like it when California takes on a challenge because they have over 50 congressional representatives. And she was able to, so Stephanie Tubbs Jones was able to help us get the final co-sponsors we needed from California to be able to get this bill rolled into the Higher Education Reauthorization Act. And it's now law. Last I checked, there's questions, I think 77, 78, and 79 on the financial aid form were specifically added because of these youth. But as you see, there's relationship. We developed strategy. We told a compelling story. And we figured out how can we utilize our power of homeless youth. The power of homeless youth was able to help write this law. So I always enjoy a good story. So there's one for you. Any questions? All righty. So I said we're going to come back to this topic of power. Before we move into power, we have to think about how do we create change and where does our power fit best? So this is called movement ecology. It's growing in popularity among social change activists. The first way we try to change the world is through personal transformation. Somebody struggling with addiction, we say we're going to help that individual get into counseling, and into treatment programs. Good. It's important work. The church does a lot of this personal transformation very, very well. We do a lot of this. But as you see, it's about a third of each of these approaches. And I'd say about 90% of the church's work ends up in personal transformation. So we got to look at, are we addressing all the different ways? The next way we can create change is alternatives. You can look at things like the Black Panthers. The police, in the 60s, they saw, as racist. So they said, we're going to develop our own police force. We'll take care of protecting the communities. And the NRA is very much in favor of gun control at that time because of that. They did not like the idea of, African Americans carrying around guns. So they were in favor of gun control at that time. You can look at, setting up co-ops. We don't like our credit unions. We don't like the corporate capitalist approaches to, banking or food distribution. So we're going to set up alternatives, our own. Problem with alternatives is they can do a lot of good work, but are they scalable? How do we, copy them to make sure that they're actually accessible? Because a lot of times, with a co-op, there are extra costs and prices. Sometimes, purchasing environmentally friendly goods or trying to recycle can become a costly enterprise for folks. So are we limiting then change to those who have the privilege to be able to engage in it? And then the final way is changing dominant institutions. And those can be divided into 4 categories that focus on power. So some say, well, if we just change who's elected to office. So right now around racial justice issues, you've had a lot of push for new prosecutors to be elected in communities who make commitments to being more racially equitable in their carrying out of their duties. Might create some change. Then you have policy advocacy. How are we in relationship with those who are in power? You have disruption, mass protest, for example. There's disrupting of power. People want to drive home and then, people are occupying a street corner and you can't get your car by. They've disrupted the status quo to try to regain power in the community. And then you have community organizers who train people in the community to build an alternative base for power. So you have these different theories all going on. And the idea of movement ecology is we need all of them. So I feel our Lutheran theology and our demeanor and a lot of these cultural things that we often associate with the Lutheran Church set us up very well for policy advocacy. We like to be in relationship. We like having, a lot of Lutherans enjoy a good academic conversation with people, and having those conversations. So that's an important role for many Lutherans to play, but it's not the only role. I know Lutherans who, were marching this summer with some of the racial justice things and got pepper sprayed. And then when their colleagues, other Lutheran pastors, heard or saw those pictures showing up of their white colleagues getting pepper sprayed, they said, oh, wow, this is actually serious. We should start paying more attention to racial justice issues. And they said, oh, wow, it took a white person getting hurt for me to notice that we needed some change. So it was one of those things where they're putting themselves out there to disrupt the status quo, help bring in more allies into that movement. Are there any questions about power? And we got our Emperor Palpatine down there with his unlimited power.
I don't know if this fits Nick exactly, but I think in terms of hunger, I remember the example that was used that I heard several years ago of how do we feed people that are hungry. One way is through charity. We've mentioned that, and doing your personal or even your church, making those peanut butter and jelly sandwiches or whatever it is. but all of that charity type work, counted all together throughout all the churches and all the charitable institutions around the country, equal about 1/20th of what national government programs like the SNAP feeding program or WIC, just to talk about the food access. So to influence our governmental actions, our broader community national actions for the general welfare is really important. It's not, even though churches should continue to do the charity things, for sure, they're very important in that immediate situation. We need to use our power to influence national programs that touch far, far more people on the whole. Yeah.
All right. So I'd like you all to help me answer this question here. What ways do we have power? And I will give you a hint. There is an answer in the study, in the advocacy guidebook for this question. What ways do we as the church have power? Or what things give us our power?
We vote.
Very good. That's right. And Lutherans do have a pretty high voter turnout rate.
We have money. We have facilities.
That's right.
We have talented people.
Education and access to information.
Absolutely.
And Jesus is on our side.
And we do have those relationships going both ways, often with those who have needs and those who can change the rules.
Yep.
And when we speak, not that we do very often, but when we speak, people do tend to listen, even if they don't like what we say. They do listen.
So I'm looking at my book right here, and I think we've nailed just about all of them. I'm going to say the last one piggybacks off of the Jesus is on our side, but the idea of that we have power through our humility as well. We're going to look at, many social movements where, hunger strikes or protest marches or where people are arrested for civil disobedience and things. There is often a faith component in those movements that draws people into that work. And there's a humility of saying, I'm going to expose myself to the violence, whether it's economic or physical or verbal violence. I will expose myself so that people can see just how bad these things are. But yeah, so I have to say power through wealth and recognition that wealth is, our facilities. It's not just our money, but if you got a church van and you got a bunch of people who need to get down to the State House or to Washington, D.C., y'all got a church van. Let's use those church vans. Let's get them out there. We all got, parish halls and fellowship halls, and, people often need meeting space. And, one of the biggest roles I say in different justice movements is that the role of the ally. And you need people to bake the cookies and set out the punch and plug in the microphone for community meetings. And that's something that we as church can do. I was recently helping a pastor write a sabbatical grant. And one of the things that we were talking about in preparing that grant application was the role of the what is the role of the church and how we open ourselves up for community conversations, for area commissions or different groups and things that want to do that work. And it's actually the church I'm sitting in right now. And things like that. So, all
Well,
right.
and
I know we're at 11:03. I have one activity that I want to do real quick before we take a break, if that's okay, Pastor Katie. So let's see, where's the drawing? All right. So one of the ways that we try to figure out who has power is through this idea of power mapping. And can people see the green lines I just drew on the screen? Okay. So I want you to think of the movie Star Wars. All right. And in the movie Star Wars, you have people who wanted to create change. So you have, let's think of somebody who like Princess Leia. She wants to create change in the galaxy. What we often do when we want to create change and we want to look at who has power, we'll lay it out in this way. So a 10 is how much going up this way. The vertical axis is how much power do they have. And going this way is how much do they agree with us. So if you get somebody at a 10 and a 10, it's going to be pretty easy to get your change because they agree with you and they have a lot of power. So what I want to start off doing is let's brainstorm a few characters in the Star Wars universe that we would like to think. You're Princess Leia. It's a new hope. You're trying to figure out how to create change in the galaxy. Who has power that she should be looking at? Agrees with her or disagrees with her?
Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Obi-Wan, absolutely.
Yoda. Are you, what, you're only talking, wait, only talking about A New Hope? In that case, then we have to delete Yoda. But
he was still out there somewhere. We can leave him in.
Okay. Well, Luke and who she doesn't even know about. And Han.
Yeah, bounty hunters.
Oh,
They're
yes.
running around.
The character played by Peter Cushing. The general.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, the droids.
The droids. Stormtroopers individually, yeah, or collectively. I'm assuming you're including the Emperor in the Imperial Senate. Is that?
Not the Emperor. I think he's a little different.
Yeah, a little.
All right. So 10 here is how much power they have. So let's start with Darth Vader. How much power does Darth Vader have?
All the power.
He's got a lot, but he doesn't agree with what Leia wants to do, right? So he's more like on the.
Do you think he disagrees the most?
No, I think the Emperor disagrees the most.
Does he have all the power?
No, he's subject to the Emperor to some extent, but he's got a lot.
Yeah.
So we probably put the
Emperor at the top, yeah.
Yeah.
As completely opposed and yeah.
Yep.
Um,
Where's Obi-Wan? How much power does Obi-Wan have?
Well, he has a lot, but it's
but
constraint. I mean, maybe
it's
8 and 10 or something.
It's restrained power. Yeah.
Yeah. Partly self-restrained to some extent. And Yoda is the same way, I think. Yoda has more than Obi-Wan, I think.
Yeah, kind of.
Kind of.
Where would Yoda agree on?
Yeah.
He pretty much agrees.
Well, they agree there's change. Maybe they never get a chance to talk about what change they're talking about. So we don't actually know how much in agreement. Like they've all just agreed they've got to get the empire out of there.
Yeah.
We don't know what they're
right.
All right. So where do Luke and Han go?
Well, and that depends
Let's
on
see.
when, right?
Yeah, exactly. What
Like
part of the story arc?
Han has his own agenda, right? It only
Yeah.
sometimes aligns with that of Leia, which is partly why they have all that arguing going on. Not
Right.
to mention
Han probably
sexual
doesn't have
tension,
much
but
of
anyway.
How much power does Han have? So if the
Well,
Emperor's here, Darth Vader's there.
No.
Where does Han go? Someone to
Yeah.
stop.
He,
Well, he has that super duper computer, or I mean,
Ship.
airship.
yeah.
Ship, yes.
Yeah,
And
he
they
has
run, what, 5
resources
cars?
and he's also not afraid to work outside the system, whatever the system is.
Oh,
That
okay.
gives
Right.
him a lot of power.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now Luke is an idealistic young kid, so he's probably has a little bit more agreement.
Yeah.
Okay. He's idealistic. He's actually in favor of the cause.
Yeah.
Yes.
He wanted to go join, but
But in
darn,
episode
Uncle
4,
Owen wouldn't
oh,
let him.
his power. Where would we
It's
put it?
pretty low.
It's pretty
Yeah.
low as he understands it. I think
Yeah.
he feels really powerless, but
Yeah.
so maybe there.
All right.
Yeah.
Bounty hunters.
They're sort of like Han in that they
Yeah.
work outside the system, and that gives them, I mean, that's interesting
Yeah.
to note that willingness to work outside the system kind of gives you,
Yeah. Gives you some freedom. To,
yeah.
But most bounty hunters aren't quite as talented as Han, so they have a little bit less power, right?
Yeah. That's why he's slightly ahead of them.
Yes. He's always barely escaping by the skin of his nose, but yeah, the skin of his teeth. Yeah.
R2D2.
Now there's an
Well-
interesting,
Being a computer.
yes. And also programmed to obey, right? I
Right.
mean, to serve, programmed to
Yeah.
serve. He tends to, does he have more than Luke? I mean,
Yeah. But you take that restraining bolt off and that little R2 unit will get himself in trouble every
Yeah.
time.
So yeah, I mean, as I think about R2, he has or R2 has the plans to the Death Star, so he has something probably
That's
a little
true.
more to offer than Luke, at least in the
Yes.
beginning, before Luke realizes, he can be a Jedi.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep. He has the information.
Where do we put stormtroopers?
Well, how?
Well,
So
they- It only takes a single blaster shot to destroy them. So I don't know how
I
powerful
don't know
they
that they have
actually
very
are.
much
Yeah.
power, but they're also not at all in alignment with Leia's
Yeah.
goal.
Yeah. I guess their
So-
power is in their sheer numbers.
Mhm.
So
No, I think lower than Han and bounty hunters,
Okay.
but
Huh.
maybe there.
All right. So
Who's
here's
left?
the thing,
Yeah.
when you begin an advocacy campaign and you're thinking about everything from, how do I get people in the congregation on board? How do we get community partners to create the change we want to see? Doing an exercise like this, and often we'll do these exercises multiple times with different groups of people to kind of try to get a lot of different perspectives on this. Because what it does then is you can say, all right, who's with us? Who are our allies? Well, as we see in the movie, Obi-Wan, R2D2, Luke, all kind of joined together with Leia to help her, right? But then what's the big switch that ends up happening that gives them the win? Eventually
Hans, yes.
Han
Han.
gets over here.
They win Han over.
yeah.
Mhm. And then they also get some help, you get some of those other folks that we could think of. Lando, for example, Lando is probably over here and Lando shifts to
Yeah.
be supportive with the Rebel Alliance.
Yeah.
And you have Leia, if we go back to that movement ecology slide, playing both, the challenging the system, let's build an alternative source of power, at the same time as she's in the Imperial Senate.
Right.
on a diplomatic mission, as she
Mission.
said, to avoid being killed by Darth Vader right away. So she's playing that inside game and that outside game at the same time in a fashion that most people can't do. But, Leia is able to pull it off because she's awesome. But so when you see this sort of thing, it's not necessarily about how do I convince the emperor to be on my side, but how does Luke eventually defeat the emperor? He gets Darth Vader to come over to his side.
Yeah.
And that's how he gets there. So it's not always about getting that person or that group of people, but pulling supporters toward you or building up your own power. So then Luke, by the third movie, goes from being a 2 or a 3 on power up to having, more than Obi-Wan, being a 7 or an 8.
Yeah.
I can pull Darth Vader. So just this is one of the ways that we begin to think strategically.
Mhm.
So I'm gonna leave it there. I know, thank you all for bearing with us for an extra 15 minutes on that. I say it's time for a break.
Yes.
And then we'll wrap up when you all come back. And then we'll wrap up by going a little bit more into details on how to apply some of this information in our congregations.
Okay, do we need 10 minutes? Or can we do it in 5? Oh, that was just not a nice way to ask that question. Okay, Carla says 5. Thank you. So we will come back. I have that it is 11:15. We'll come back at 11:20. Thank you.
I was born by the river in this little old town. Just like this river, I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming. I know change is gonna come. Oh, yes, it is. It's been too hard living. I don't wanna die, no. 'Cause I don't know what's up there. Oh, beyond the clouds. It's been a long time. look at me, all is fished up and swung at me. It's a good thing I got down on my knees. The time that I'm there, oh no, lost, left, and alone. But somehow I know I'm still able to carry on. Well, it's been a long time coming. I know change is gonna come. Change gonna come. Oh, yes it is. Change is gonna come. Change has got to come tonight. Oh, change is gonna come. Change has got to come. I know. Change is gonna come. I know it's gonna come, baby. A change is gonna come. It's gonna be here now. It's been a long time coming. But I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. A long time coming, but I know change gonna come.
September 77, Port Elizabeth weather fine. It was business as usual in police room 619. Oh,
Alrighty, we're at 11:21. Are people back? See, still many cameras off.
Because so my back, the man is dead.
Music today was from a CD called Playing for Change, where they went around and recorded a bunch of people playing the same song. Before there was like TikTok stitching or whatever people do now. They went around to different musicians all across the globe and recorded people and then put it all together on a lot of different of these songs connected into different social justice and community and peace and all these feel good things that we all like. So Playing for Change if you want to get a good music selection. All right. So 1, 2, 3, 4. I see 4 of us here and 5 names. Are the 5 names back and just leaving cameras off? If you could put in the chat or give a thumbs up or something if you're there, and we'll go ahead and get started. Chris is here. Woo-hoo. Jan is here. All right. Not sure where Glenn, Bonnie, and Sarah are, but Bonnie's here. All right, thank you. Okay. Well, the reason why I wanted to get through that power mapping and discussion on power a little bit is so that we could come back after break and start talking about how we take this into our congregation. Talked about some theory of how do we create change, kind of in the big sense. But I really encourage you during this conversation to think about your local context and how we can, how our conversation from here on in really kind of start to dive in deep on how do we apply some of these things? How do we create that change that we want to see in the world? One thing I always like to state is that, our goal is not to build a thing. We have things like a big event where we get lots of people to show up for. That isn't necessarily our end goal. Our end goal is to create change conditions in the world, whether it's to end hunger or expand a program so that more kids are getting fed. So the programs that we do, hey, let's do a hunger walk. Let's do a rally. Let's have an advocacy day. Those are steps to get toward the thing we want. Too often, I think in the advocacy world, secular and faith-based, we measure ourselves and success and failure based on if we can build a big thing and get some nice pictures. And here's a great example of why that shouldn't be our goal. For example, at the State House right now, if there's a bad bill that's moving, we don't, I've seen maybe once in my life where a vote comes up where the vote fails and it's a good thing. Okay. And it was probably the only time I saw is when former Senator John McCain, Republican from Arizona, when they were trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act, walked in, knowing he had cancer, knowing he only had months to live, knowing that he was going to cast a deciding vote on the key signature program of his political rival in the 2008 election. And he walks in as a US Senator, and then he goes up and puts his thumb down. That's the only time in my nearly 20 years of doing advocacy work that I've seen something like that happen. Normally, a bad bill dies by just no one talking about it anymore, by not coming up for a vote. And I have some colleagues who are always like, oh, I hope they have another hearing so we get a chance to testify. And I say, no. They're like, but we need to have X number of people testify this year for our grant. I'm like, no, if we can not have a hearing on it, it means we win. So not, and yeah, you got people and community members all ready to go, but it's like, we got to find other opportunities. So having a big thing isn't necessarily the goal. If we can, make what, if you have a person in your congregation, for example, who runs your local sanitation department, trash pickup, and your congregation says, they want to change how they do trash pickup to the front of the house instead of the alleyway, and this is going to negatively impact seniors who will have difficulty moving their cans. It's an actual issue in Columbus right now. So if you are organizing your congregation around this and the director of sanitation is in the congregation, why don't you just walk up to him during coffee hour and say, hey, here's an issue, could you, and he says, oh, yeah, you're right, that's a big issue. Let's have a meeting about that so we don't have to do it. Problem solved. That's better than having to go through all the organizing and other efforts. And that's advocacy. And as we talked about earlier, we have those relationships. So keep that in mind as we talk about these things. So the first step I always think is good for our congregations to do is to build off the current interest and passions. If your congregation's down volunteering at a local food pantry every week, that's where you want to start with your advocacy. If you're collecting for women and and families in domestic violence situations, there's a great place to start your advocacy. If y'all are going down to the river to pick up trash every week, I don't know much about the environmental needs. I was getting schooled on Thursday. It was great. It was wonderful about clean water. I'll connect you to people who know about clean water and get you connected into those networks. So build off of the current interest. It doesn't even need to be something that the congregation is doing as a congregation. Because remember, we're a community. So if a bunch of people in the congregation are going out once a month and reading to kids in schools, or you have a bunch of teachers in your congregation, you got a passion for education advocacy that's already there. Have those conversations, look around, have the, talk with the folks about what their passion is. One of the things I always encourage folks to do are one-on-one conversations. A one-to-one is a community organizing practice where you will, I always say, listen about 70% of the conversation and ask very intentional questions. Go grab coffee with some new member of the congregation and have this deep level conversation. They'll feel like, wow, this person really values me, and it'll welcome them into the community. Encourage, have, if you got, kind of a span of generations in the congregation, have young folks ask the older folks, hey, can we go grab lunch tomorrow? After worship together and talk, or have one of the older folks ask one of the kids, hey, I really think that's interesting. One of the younger folks, you were talking, I heard you talking, I'd love to learn more about you and what you're working on, in college. Let's go grab lunch together and have that kind of conversation to figure out where these interests and passions are in the congregation. So then once you kind of have a sense of where the passions and interests are, engaging experts. Talk to the coalitions that are already doing advocacy. Talk to the social service providers. Talk to the people who have lived experiences. If you have folks in your congregation, and maybe talk to the pastor and say, hey, are there any folks, that, we could be, that we know are need of financial assistance on a regular basis. And maybe the past, and obviously confidentiality and all that needs to be protected. But, maybe there's opportunities there with those people being empowered to be the leaders on some of these efforts as well. So invite them in, have it a Sunday school class. Young folks right now, they are leading the way on everything. I sit in rooms often and I'm the oldest person in there and they look at me like, I'm from an ancient world because I, had AOL when I was in high school. And they look at me, and I just love it because I'm like, we've been working, I'm burned out, I get burned out and I'm not even 40 yet. And, but there's so much energy in, these 20 somethings right now. That's just great. Listen, take cues from them, listen to them, and have them help to lead the way on a lot of these things. So those are the first two steps. Move forward together, identify the interests and passions of your congregation, and then start talking to community partners, experts, research. We're in Columbus, I'm in Columbus. So, there's, a never ending supply of experts on a subject between all of our colleges and universities and the politicians, but they're not really experts on things. Does anybody have any questions or comments or thoughts? If anyone's an external processor and are trying to process through this within your congregation, let's use this time to dive into these two ideas. No? Okay. So moving forward, the next thing, as you're engaging folks, you're kind of starting to have these deeper level conversations. I often say, after you go out and volunteer at a food pantry on a Saturday afternoon, on Sunday, should have the Bible study or adult Sunday school class, ask the question, why were people hungry in the first place? What does the Bible say about hunger? What does it mean for, when we say every single week, give us this daily bread? Let's unpack that. What is our theology? What is our story about these things? But one of the important parts is making sure that we, as kind of the leaders of these different efforts, can communicate why we care about it. And as mentioned earlier, about us having relationships with folks who, all throughout kind of the need, of different levels of need and resources, and, people in the line at the pantry, the volunteers and staff at the pantry, those who donate to the pantry. We have relationships all across the board. But then the question is, what is your story? Because in our advocacy, I'm much less effective if I go out there and say, here's this person's story. That's not my own. And I've grown up middle class. I'm straight, cisgendered, white, male, Protestant in Ohio. I check just about every box of majority, and often as a church, we're looking at those who have been marginalized in society. And as my friend, Pastor Angel up in Northeastern Ohio said, imagine, all the systems of our world designed like one of those marble runs. And she said, when I came in to speak with one of her groups, she said, so my friend Nick Bates is the marble. The system was designed for him, and it absolutely was. So my story isn't necessarily as compelling unless I can figure out how my story fits in with other things. And it does. So one of the ways I like to think of storytelling is around the story of self, story of us, story of now. And if you go once again to your book and your resource, one of the problems of being virtual is I would have brought these and handed them out to everybody if we would have been in person, but you can find that online. So the idea is, how do we tell a story that is compelling? There was this young guy out of the Midwest once, and he did this pretty well. He told a story about, his mom dying of cancer and the mounting medical debt. And feel free to post in the chat once you figure out who I'm talking about. So he went forward and he started telling people this story about his mom struggling with medical debt and what that was like for him. And then he kind of began to talk about the shared values of the community. No person in our country or in our community should have to, spend their when their parent is dying, spend those final days of their life worrying about debt instead of being able to spend time and their energy with them to say their final goodbyes and have those closing moments. So he told this story a lot. He told this story in a lot of different states, and he got elected to an office, and he kept telling the story. And as he told the story, he said, let's do something about it. Anybody know who I'm talking about? Who used this exact same theory of storytelling developed by Marshall Gans out of Harvard very successfully? Is a young guy named Barack Obama. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. So he did this as he ran for the US Senate, and then he did this as he ran for president. And once he got elected, he said, now we need to pass the Affordable Care Act. Now, whether you think that's good policy or bad policy, we could debate that all day. But it was his storytelling that invited people in to creating reform and passing that policy that, to this day is listed as one of his signature policy accomplishments, because he was good at storytelling. So now we can think about for us, and I was originally thinking we might break into small groups and do this, but for the sake of time, we won't do that. But does anybody, have a story that comes to mind for them that they would like to share with the group and try to kind of walk through this process? Tell a story, because nobody can disagree with your story. Then you connect it into the wider community, our shared values, and then you talk about, therefore, we can take action. Does anybody want to try it out? All right, go ahead, Bonnie.
Well, a few years ago, I spent 3 months in Calcutta, India, and I found that there were people who lived literally on the sidewalks in Calcutta. And they often made tents with sheets or bedspreads hung over a fence and draped over. I also noticed that they begged often for food. And I began a practice of eating food, only half of my food, and taking the other half with me in a bag. And I would often either place it with a person sitting on the sidewalk or near a tent house that I saw on the sidewalk. When I returned home, I found that I had a distinct problem, because when I would go to restaurants and have food presented, it was way more than I needed. And one of the things that I have come to do, because as I travel between here and Germantown, there are several people on corners looking for handouts. And so I now take a bag of goods with me, whether it be canned food that can be easily accessed with silverware in a plastic sleeve to hand out people. And I think that's an easy thing that we can replicate and change our community in a significant way. If I have time to stop and talk with the person, I will ask them what they need. And this was ever so purposeful, as one day I asked a fella, did he need toothbrush and toothpaste? And he said, ma'am, I have 3 teeth. I
Mm.
have enough toothpaste and toothbrushes to satisfy them. I said, so then you don't need dental floss either. And I tell this story often. And I said, well, what do you need? And I happen to carry things that I can give away in my trunk. And so I pulled over and stopped, and he said, oh, Diet Coke, may I have one of those? I said, I'll give you two. And he was a happy man. So
Great.
I share that story, inviting anyone or my community of faith, because it's easy to roll down a window and say, here's $7 in quarters. I saved my quarters also for the same reason. You know, it's not a lot. It's not going to break me, but it might buy somebody a hamburger that day.
Mhm. Yeah, so you did the story, and that was a real powerful story itself. So thank you for sharing and volunteering. Story of us, I think you started to invite us in, and maybe be adding a few kind of specifics of, as a person of faith, we are called to feed our neighbor and guarantee. So kind of really be very intentional about what community you're speaking to.
Okay.
You mentioned, driving, over to Germantown. So obviously when you're talking to your local community, they'll be able to visualize that and be able to see themselves into your story. And then the story of now, and really trying to say, what's that action step that we can all take? Is it, an individual action, that you were talking about, or is there kind of that collective action that we could do as a society? So then that would be the next part of really trying to figure that out. But yeah, I mean, it's, and this is the thing about storytelling. There's a reason why Jesus told parables and story all the time. It's because it works. As I started off doing, I love data. That's the story I want to hear. So thank you, Bonnie, for that. And, and the other thing is, as you look at, your story could go a lot of different ways, from that experience. You could talk about, where you're in India and this experience, you could say, and right now, and this is one thing I like to do is how can we take one story and apply it a lot of different ways, kind of like the parables in the Bible, a lot of different lessons we can learn. The COVID vaccine right now in a lot of countries, including the United States and around the globe, there's a lot of inequity in distribution. So I'm thinking about those people on the street, in India and living there. Are they going to get access to the vaccines that they need and the healthcare? And therefore, as a church, and this is one of those things where, the church can be countercultural in ways that, most American politicians and organizations just can't be. We can say, you know what, maybe we should be producing extra vaccine right now in the United States to provide around the globe to make sure that we actually have global health, because just vaccinating one group of people in the world is like having a peeing section of the swimming pool. It ain't gonna work. So we can think through a lot of these different things, and storytelling takes practice. I think we've all heard sermons of pastors who are amazing storytellers, pastors and deacons who are amazing storytellers. We've all heard some sermons where they're not good storytellers. So this is one of the things, and as an activity in the congregation, you go out, you have your youth do a mission trip, or you do a congregational mission trip. Come back and have people write down their stories, record their stories, do a video project to capture those experiences in a powerful way. Is something that we can do with this. Very easy, and people always run that barrier of, is this going to be seen as political? Are people going to push back on it? Well, no, these are just our stories. If somebody shares a story about their travels or things that they're doing like Bonnie did, or someone sharing a story about, when my mom was dying of cancer like Barack Obama did, or I share a story about my son when he realized a friend of his when he was in first grade was hungry and stole from him. Like you've all I think most people on this call have heard me do that story plenty of times. Whatever the story is, we can practice it and share it to be effective. And having those kind of common stories that we can take that are relatable to the community we're talking to, so we can share them in the congregation to kind of build up our base. And then when we start engaging community partners, and then when we start engaging legislators, we can, by the point we're getting the legislator, we should have had the story told a million different times in a million different ways, so that it's going to be real effective. And just, you got all the right pauses and kind of some of those stylistic things as well. Any questions about storytelling and the role it plays in our advocacy work? So all of this work occurs before we even start thinking about what are our action steps to create the policy changes that we want to see. So one of the things I always encourage people to do, you're listening to the congregation and the community, and be aware sometimes the need of the community is going to push your congregation in ways they might not be ready to go. But if you can have these stories, have the relationships within the congregation first, it then helps it be easier to move it forward, because this isn't then, a big partisan idea to go out and figure out how we can engage on the state budget, which is where we're spending most of our time right now, is working on the state budget and a few other things. It's, those people really do care about hungry neighbors, and they're volunteering, and they've shared the stories about volunteering, and they're doing all this great work, and they say they need this. Well, they probably do. It's not a partisan thing now. It's, Bob's story, it's Carla's story, it's Glenn's story, it's Bonnie's story, et cetera, et cetera. So it's real important to do that listening. So once you reach that place, you kind of got a coalition within your congregation, you've learned about some issues, you've talked to community partners, you've done the Bible studies, people have started sharing their stories around things. Be able to identify the issue. What is the issue you actually want to create change around? Is that I want to reduce hunger in my community. I want to make sure that our food pantries have the resources they need. My example here is I want to make sure that Ohio schools right now are not providing an adequate education. In rural Ohio, we just celebrated the anniversary of the Durrell school funding state Supreme Court case a couple weeks ago. Identify the issue. What is it that we want to solve? If you could wave a magic wand, what would you want to fix around the issue that your congregation or community care about? Then identify the solution. What is it that we need people to do? And once again, don't go into political or partisan terms. Don't even, we need to fix school funding in Ohio so that all kids get, and also bring in those values. So we want to make sure we believe that every child deserves a great education. Nobody's against that. They might be against how we do it, or, addressing some of the inequities when we really get into the details, but we want to start off in a way as just identifying the big issue. We want kids in Vinton County, in Columbus City schools, and even in Olentangy schools to receive a great education. Glenn, that Olentangy was for you. Up there with all the property growth and all. So then the final thing that we need to look at is how do we achieve it? So we don't throw all this onto our congregation at once, but as we were doing our learning, we identify the issue. There's inequality in the system. People are going hungry. Whatever, the water is polluted. Whatever the issue is that you want to address, you identify that issue, and then you build the support. Like, that's an issue. Then you identify solutions. Well, we need to stop that factory from polluting. We need to fix school funding. We need to improve wages, whatever the issue is. And then we say, how can we do that? And this is where you might get into a specific public policy. So on education, there's a bipartisan Cupp-Patterson funding formula. The Ohio House of Representatives overwhelmingly passed it last year. The Ohio Senate, because of the power structure there, is not very interested in the Cupp-Patterson school funding fix. Bob Cupp is the Speaker of the Ohio House, so you can see clearly the person who has a lot of power in the Ohio House of Representatives is very supportive of this idea. And then John Patterson was the Democratic co-sponsor. But the Senate, very different power dynamics there, so very much less supportive. So any questions or thoughts on these three things to do as we look to develop our action plans? And feel free to think about your own congregation.
I'm not sure if this is exactly what addressed here, but I can think of two kind of general objections that might come up to a congregation proposing to act on something. One is the church shouldn't be involved in politics. Well, the simple answer to that is we inevitably are involved already, just as individuals and as an organization in a community and in a state. So the question is not, are we going to be involved in politics, but how are we going to do it? And what you've been laying out is a way to be involved in a a positive and constructive way. And the second thing that people sometimes say is, well, shouldn't the church be separate from the state? You know, and there are various actual laws about that, but the church cannot be partisan as far as individual races. Like you can't come out in favor of Joe versus Frank, you know, in an election, but you can come out in favor of feeding hungry people, you know, or you can come out in favor of an adequate education for people. So on issues, the church can come out, you know, with a particular side to that. Is maybe Nick has something more to say about that, but
Yeah.
to me, those are two particular objections that people sometimes raise up in congregations.
So, and thanks for bringing that up, Glenn. And, you know, a lot of this approach that I encourage folks to take tries to minimize that. So as we look at,
Right.
you know, in our congregations, there are going to be people, as soon as we say, we need to feed the hungry, you know, you say that in a sermon, even though like how many times Jesus say it, are going to get mad because they think you're talking about communism. And that's where their mind goes, even though you're just quoting Jesus and saying what the Bible says we should be doing. So when they are going to always be there, but you know, as we think about it, and they might be powerful people in the congregation. But so once again, think about that power map. Let's say that person is absolutely against you doing anything about hunger or anything about any kind of justice issue. They might be up there where Emperor Palpatine is, right? But then how do we, through storytelling, through the hands-on experiences of volunteering, you know, it was because Leia worked with Han that she pulled him over. Well, and then Han kind of got the hots for her, you know, so there's that too. But, you know, pulled him over. And then as people see, latch into the story, latch into the service, when they can hear themselves in the story, as you do the story of self, story of us, story of now, then they pull over. Then when you say, hey, to address hunger, we should sign on to this support letter, or there are people going down to the State House next week to talk about this issue. That person's still going to say that, but then hopefully by that point, you now have enough people on your side that say, what are you talking about? We've been talking about this for 6 months, ending hunger, and you haven't been at anything. So they're going to still raise a ruckus, but it's kind of how do you kind of move forward with those who are willing. And that's one of the things, you know, people, you know, as Glenn was saying, politics is going on in our church. It might be going on in the pulpit. It might be going on in the parish hall during a Sunday school lesson, or it might be going on in the parking lot. And I will say the parking lot political conversations are where no longer is the gospel being centered, but selfish and personal interests are now being centered in those quiet after meeting. And we all been on church councils or part of different committees, and we know about the back talk that can go on in the parking lot, you know, in the real meeting, you know, which is the meeting after the meeting that's happening in the parking lot. So the question is, do we want to center our conversations around difficult issues? And I always say, you know what, somebody can disagree with Cup Patterson. That's fine. It's not perfect. There's a lot of problems with it. But the advantage of having something to talk about is saying it's better than what we have now. It's pretty decent. And if you disagree with it, fine. Let's have, what do you think should be the new policy proposal? Because if everybody's talking about how to fix school funding, whatever result is going to be better than what we probably have now. So that's one of the big things, you know, we can disagree about how to end hunger. Somebody can say, no, I really think SNAP is not the right approach. I'd rather send out just food boxes to all the hungry families. Or some people say we should just have universal basic income and get rid of all the different social benefit programs. just send everyone a check for $2,000 a month. Bam, they'll be more efficient and effective. I mean, I'm not entirely against that idea. In theory, there's a lot of practical issues with it and how that would be implemented. But there's a lot of different ways we can look at these things, and I'm okay with disagreeing on solutions, but we have to agree as people of faith, we are called to engage the world, and that's a bigger theological question than we can solve. That requires a lot of pastoral leadership as well, and a lot of difficult conversations, which, once again, getting back into those one-on-ones, building up those relationships. So knowing we are close to time, I'm going to just put all of these up. And if you look in your books that I would have handed out that you can access online, you can see these different approaches to so we got people on our, interested, the congregation wants to engage. We agree we need to pass House Bill 1. We need to increase food bank funding. We need to stop, Senate Bill 17. Those are all real numbers, and how we should be thinking about them. Stop Senate Bill 17, support House Bill 1, increase funding for food banks in the state budget. Remember those. So are there any of these things, are pretty common sense approaches that we could then do as a community to create change? I wasn't planning on going into full in depth on anyone, but really asking folks, what is it that you have questions on looking at?
What kind of social media activity actually gets results? Because my experience on Facebook is that things provide fodder for argument and little actual movement.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chris. Great question. And I was actually going to say, if no one wanted to talk, I was going to go to the social media one page in the booklet.
All right.
So the big thing I would say is, one, make sure you're sharing accurate news. And know what your goal is. Is your goal to raise awareness among your network on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, TikTok, whatever? As long as if you're sharing accurate news and kind of that's your goal, that's something. I would say to engage legislators, you can actually do it, especially with local and state legislators, your state representative and things. I've had Andy Brenner, I think it was Andy Brenner, I think, who actually engaged on the Hunger Network Facebook page when I tagged him in a post, and he himself was commenting in response to it on our Facebook page, which is great. It was a very civil dialogue on some issue, because he was supporting an issue that we were supportive of. So you'll get online petitions a lot of times. So if we have a petition going out, that's normally to figure out who's interested in the, we got a big list, figure out who's interested in this specific issue for us to then engage in more detail around that. Some petitions are just big mass email gathering things through moveon.org a lot of times, unless you know the specific organization behind it. They're just trying to get your email address to add to their list. So, I always say, be respectful online. Don't get into the argument with the, wackadoo uncle. I used to use the term crazy, and I was told by mental health advocates that wasn't appropriate. And I said, so what should I call those people online? They told me wackadoo. So don't get in arguments with the wackadoos on the internet. It's not worth it. You're not going to convince anyone. It's going to raise your blood pressure. It's not good self-care. You're not going to accomplish anything. Make the one point. My son is a tween, starting to engage on social media. I tell him, if other people have already started commenting against something ridiculous that somebody says, leave it there. You don't engage with them. But tagging legislators, especially when they do something good, follow their social media accounts, comment on there, because a lot, especially at the state level, a lot of them are reading and engaging on social media. I think Twitter is a more effective avenue than Facebook. because a lot of legislators, I've literally tweeted out something during a committee hearing and seen a legislator quote my tweet in a committee hearing, because like all of us, they often are doing other things behind their screens. Which no one's doing that today, I'm sure. So yeah, that's what some of the ways I encourage people to engage. And you know, call them out when they're doing something inappropriate, but also remember to call them out when they're doing something good for the community, because then when they see that, they'll recognize you actually want to be part of solutions. Bonnie.
My question is, you know, how to know, I mean, I can see hunger in my community, I can see hunger on the street corner, but the whole concept of trying to develop something worthy of a conversation with a legislator, I feel totally inept about even trying to attempt.
Mhm.
And I really don't feel like, I'm going to say it, I'm not sure I want to follow a legislator's Facebook or tweet page. I don't have a tweet account myself,
Yeah.
Twitter. So I don't, other than listening to you and that, you know, these issues are coming up, that's my best source of knowing what legislative pieces are worthy of gathering. Got any hints there?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you so much for sharing. One, I think your story, you know, the story you shared earlier, I think is something that legislators need to know, because they don't see, you know, and I think a lot of people in society don't see the people that you're engaging, you know, as you drive. You know, so if you ever have one of those conversations, and I know there, you know, I've, you know, it's one of these stories where a guy came up to me at a gas station and he asked for, he said, man, I ain't gonna cuss word, but, you know, lost my job. My girlfriend broke up with me. I got kicked out of my apartment, evicted, you know, I'm living back there on the streets now. I really could just use a beer today. And I said, well, dude, I don't got any cash for you, but I do have, I was coming home from a party and I brewed my own beer in true Lutheran fashion. And I had a couple of beers in the back of my car from this event. But I'm like, I'll give you a couple of these. They're kind of funky homebrew, you know, peach something or other. And so I gave them those. They went back behind the gas station. We're drinking them, finished pumping my gas, and I'm getting ready to leave. And as I'm pulling out, they look over at me like, man, these are really, this is amazing. This hit the spot. This just lifted my whole day. You know, and here's the thing. Luckily, he didn't lie to me, because if he said he just needed cash for the bus or to buy food for his kid, I'd be like, sorry, dude, no cash, because I didn't have any cash on me. But he was honest with me, so we had a little bit of a relationship. You know, so that's one of those stories of kind of similar of what you shared earlier, that I kind of keep in the back pocket to kind of build some relationships with people. You know, so yeah, I think really fine tuning our story. And then you know, so actually the next page, I think here, partnering with existing orgs. So Bonnie, I know you've been to stuff of ours before and are on our email list. Yeah, because we'll send out those email things, and when, especially at the State House, when those emails go into legislators, I get responses from them at times. You know, I was meeting with Juanita Brennan the other day, state rep out of Cleveland, and she was like, so the other day you sent this thing out in your email, I wanted to ask you about it. I'm like, okay. So that was really encouraging and helpful to know that. Yeah, so they do read those emails. You know, we often put subject title, so if they're only looking at the subject line, they know where we stand. So we try to provide those resources to make it easier for people to tell stories. And if you have that extra story or that personal experience, add that in. Otherwise, you know, we often, you know, in those email templates, it's a very generic language that still gets the point across as people of faith. But remember,
Right.
we are experts on our own story. Glenn.
Yeah, I want to peg into both what you and Bonnie were saying, because her story earlier about her personal experience, Bonnie, you know, of trying to address very personally the needs you see around you. That's a great story that leads into an email or a letter to a legislator saying, well, what more can we do about this situation?
Yep.
Okay.
Isn't there something that we as a community as a whole can do about that? And, you know, that leads you into either statewide issues, maybe, or even national issues. And then you asked about what kind of sources there are to learn. And I think the Hunger Network is one. The ELCA Advocacy Network, which you can easily find, elca.org, and just follow the links, you know, and there's an advocacy source that's constant, and organizations like Bread for the World. Just go bread.org, and that gives you all kinds of information on national and international issues if you want to follow it that far. I don't do social media, as you were talking about, but I do emails. I write, occasionally I'll write a letter, but it's usually electronic, or a letter to the editor. Legislators' offices read the opinion pages, and they want to see what their constituents have in mind. So that can be, especially if you mention the legislator's name in your letter to the editor, that can be an indirect way of communicating to them. So anyway, those are some ideas that.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. So right here, I have a link. We actually have a draft letters to the editor. So it always works out when somebody brings up the next slide. So the slide before this was partner with existing orgs like the Hunger Network. Make sure you're on our email list. Glenn mentioned the ELCA Advocacy, Bread for the World, and many others. There's advocacy groups for everybody. You look at the conference list at a hotel, somewhere, and you'll see, the Dental Hygienist Association of America or whoever. Everybody's got an advocacy group, which is great, representing those interests. So find out those groups that are representing things you're concerned about, whether faith or non-faith. If you're looking at things from a non-faith perspective, I work with so many different faith leaders that can say, oh, yep, here's the faith language or the Bible stories around that issue, to bring it, an issue around like the League of Women Voters is working on good government stuff. How do we bring that into our congregations? Well, we got Bible stories all over the place on those sorts of things. And remember that we are not doing this work alone, and we are the experts of our own stories. As we go forward in developing our advocacy work in our congregations, everyone has a story. And those stories taken together by legislators can help them have a better worldview. So even if you don't know exactly on how your issue tags in, a couple of weeks ago, I did about 20 legislative meetings with constituents. It was an exhausting week during our advocacy week with the Council of Churches. I was exhausted by the end of it, but I was just so moved hearing all these different stories and these conversations about people sharing, about their local food pantry, inviting legislators into your food pantry, showing them around, just saying, what can we do so that we don't need to have this anymore? Or we've been seeing a lot of, young moms coming in. What can we do? And ask them what their ideas are. And you can see on the screen here some links. We have sample letters to the editor around the state budget, as well as an email that you can send into your state legislature. Well, thank you all.
Perfect.
For your time today. Are there any final questions that people have? Yeah, Bonnie.
I'll just say that how it's been really interesting for me to see how different varieties of people have stepped up in serving people who are hungry. One of the restaurants called Farmer in the Deli in Germantown gave out free lunches since school closed in March of last year to anyone who came by. And they did a Channel 7 news story on them as well. And, who'd have thought that a tiny restaurant in a tiny burg, could feed 10,000 children. But in the year time, they have fed over 10,000 meals, and they've expanded their giving to seniors. And I mean, it's phenomenal. Once you begin looking at what can I do and what can I do with what I have, God has a way of multiplying that in profound ways.
Yep.
And sometimes it's just a matter of raising up stories that nobody heard about. I mean, several years ago, there were finally some stories going around about hunger among college students. And there was a movement at Capital University to establish a pantry there to help. And now this is a problem I knew about because I'd had a son who was a college student. And if I hadn't asked searching questions, I would not have known he was going hungry, because he wasn't going to fess up to mom about this. And then I started investigating. And interestingly enough, I was interested to notice that Oregon started including college students automatically in the SNAP program. And that got me
Wow.
started thinking about, what could we be doing closer to home in Ohio, asking whether that was happening here. But anyway, but what I remember most about that Capital University initiative was the backlash that we got from a bunch of middle-class pastors, quite frankly, sorry, who said, "You gotta be kidding, only poor people are hungry." And they just presumed that poor people couldn't be college students. And that made me so mad. But it also gave me an opportunity to share stories about real live college students who were going hungry. And I still don't know if Ohio does that for college students with SNAP, but it's certainly something that needs to happen for sure when the kids come back to school again. So anyway, I diverted. But
I know
these
Wittenberg
stories are
has
really
schools, yeah.
important. Yeah, these stories are important because we all have blinders, despite all those pastors had, once I lifted it up, they were kind of ashamed of themselves, but they had good hearts. They just thought they were advocating for a particular group of people, and they thought these were not those people. So you just need to sometimes, I'm going back to what Nick said about his last line on the slide, which is, it's helpful to have critical people who are always looking at the optics and saying, who's not here who should be here?
Mhm.
And that's really an important part of it too. Some people are better at that than others. So we could go on all day, obviously, now that we're warmed up. But we won't, because it's a
while.
lovely day in spring and you have some things to do, I'm sure. Nick, do you have any last minute things you want to say before we?
No, thank you all. Feel free to reach out at any time. My email, nick@hungernetohio.com. If you don't have it, I think many of you already do. Happy to come into congregations, to begin talking about things. But really I encourage everyone to just, start having those conversations within the congregation, thinking about what are some of these common stories that we have that should be rising up to higher levels. And I know I love hearing stories, and I love it when other people can go with me in the legislative offices, but I carry those stories with me and try to share them in a very, as appropriately as possible, to pass them along to the legislators, to help them to be the community leaders that we need them to be.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm hoping you all go and have the equally stimulating conversations in your congregations to stimulate thought and lifting of voices and action whenever that's appropriate. So thank you so much. I'm going to close us in prayer. I'm going to close us in prayer. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Gracious and loving God, we are so grateful to have Nick with us to serve as a resource in this congregation, in this synod, to congregations who want to use, to act on their call to speak for those who cannot speak, and to lift those who have been denied a voice into the arena so that they can use their voice to speak for their own needs. We pray for all of those who suffer from the effects of poverty or oppression that diminishes the abundant life that you wish for each and every one of them. We pray that all will come to see that God's will is for the life that truly is life, an abundance of life, of blessing. There is enough blessing in the world, and it just needs to splash over onto everyone. We pray that we could, each of us, play a role in the splashing of your blessing upon all those who need it. We pray these things in Jesus' name, and all God's people say, amen. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely day.
You too, ma'am. Good to see you.